It did not come home. After all, it certainly didn't come home. So now anyone that's watched my last video thinks I look stupid, which I do. But anyway, today, my friends, first of all, welcome back to the Really Easy History channel. However, today we are not talking about the history of Britain or England. We are talking about something entirely different. We're going over to North Africa today to talk about Egypt, in particular ancient Egypt. One of my favourite things to study, one of my favourite parts of history. So let's get straight into this without further ado. Ever since I was a small child, one of the most fascinating parts of the world, and history in general, to me, was always ancient Egypt. I always loved the pyramids, the Sphinx, the mummies, the hieroglyphics, the sarcophaguses, the pharaohs, the cat statues, the way they lived so long ago. It was almost the stuff of fairy tales. It was almost unreal. When I was about 8 years old, I was about to go to Egypt. But then we were forced to cancel as a family, and I was heartbroken. Word to T2 and Jodie. Well, my friends, never mind that. Ancient Egypt is one of the earliest logged advanced civilizations on the planet, if not the first. And to think the ruins of buildings such as temples, tombs, etc., artifacts are still there, drawings of hieroglyphics. The fact that they are still there today, thousands of years later, is insane. Today, we are going to be talking about Egyptian history from the Predynastic Period, so basically prehistory, in 5000 BC, all the way through to the Old Kingdom, the end of the Old Kingdom, because there were three kingdoms in ancient Egypt during the dynasties, and of course, out of the three kingdoms, we only have time to talk about the first one today. Anything past that is simply for another video, or this one is going to be about 10 hours long, which I really do not want, as they were around for many centuries, even millennia, my friends. The Egyptians were literally around for like thousands of years. The first humans that are known to have roamed ancient Egypt date all the way back to 700,000 BCE. That is the scale of time that human beings have roamed the area in Egypt, in North Africa. It is insane. Anyway, starting off with the pre-dynastic period, which lasted from roughly 5000 BCE to 3100 BCE, small farming settlements grew until they eventually became advanced societies dotted along the world-famous River Nile. Long ago, Africa, and even the Sahara Desert, was greener than it is today. The land would have been different due to climate change and how long ago this was. Believe it or not, there was actually a time when Antarctica was covered in trees rather than ice. Yes, a long, long time ago. But it was the case, because millions of years ago, the continents were in a different position, and even united under a supercontinent known as Pangaea. That's what it's known as to us today. My point is, it's difficult to imagine Egypt as anything other than a sandy, hot, dry desert region with camels roaming around the land. However, back in the day, this wasn't always the case, and an Egyptian pharaoh like Tutankhamun would have never have even seen a camel in his life, as there were none in Egypt at the time. That literally were no camels, they came afterwards. The Nile would have been quite a lush green region, because around 5000 BC they used to experience floods which irrigated the land naturally. And the pyramids of Giza themselves, they're also believed to have looked much different. In the sun, you'd see them shining from miles away, as millennia ago they were covered in white, highly polished limestone with gold tips. So that's one thing that I always found very interesting. The whole reason that I'm bringing any of these things up is to paint a picture of how Egypt actually was at the time, as it isn't very common knowledge to us today. In the early days, to begin with, the region was actually split into Upper and Lower Egypt, and strangely, Lower Egypt was on top of Upper Egypt. Yeah, it's strange. It was kind of backwards. Not saying that their society was backwards. Actually, the Egyptians were so advanced, in fact, that it even impresses me in 2026 AD. So, yeah, I mean, you know, they were actually miles ahead of every other civilization on the earth at the time. So I'm not calling them backwards, but the way that on the map, the upper is below, that just baffles me. But yes, the regions were split into two kingdoms initially, but in 3100 BC, the two regions along the Nile were united by King Narmer, also known as King Menes, King Means. And the capital city was established, which was Memphis, not to be confused with Memphis from America. Just saying, in case you were thinking of Memphis in Tennessee. No, Memphis in Egypt. The earliest surviving hieroglyphics and tombs come from this period. If you look at the region, it is no wonder why Egypt thrived. With no competition to the west, with the Sahara being a barren desert, with unlivable conditions, which was more or less uninhabited, barring the time where, thousands of years ago there were trees there. Humans were forced out of the Sahara into this region, as the Nile was, of course, habitable because we had water and therefore vegetation. The land was very fertile. And not only this, the Sinai Peninsula was also to the right, acting as a land bridge into Asia for trade or to transport armies across. The Nubian kingdom below was separated by cataracts in the Nile, and the river was genuinely one of the most fertile regions going at the time, with lots of agriculture and farmers. Not to mention, their natural resources made the area very rich, and the ability to trade across the sea to the Mediterranean with Anatolia, modern day Turkey, Greece, ancient Greece of course, and ancient Rome, if they weren't at war, was also a massive advantage, as anyone that wanted to attack them from above had to cross the ocean, and they had nowhere near as much power. Most of their enemies to begin with were just small tribes. The people in Upper and Lower Egypt had already established settlements by 4000 BC, a very long time ago. The issue was, sometimes, being reliant on the Nile floods, they wouldn't have enough fertility to feed everyone, or the land would literally just be destroyed from too much flooding. To the north, Mahdi culture arose, and to the south, Nakada culture appeared. The south was richer, but the Mahdis were in contact with the Levant region, who would trade gold and lapis lazuli. You think Minecraft this? By 3500 BC, Nakada expanded both north and south. There were 3 cities to the south, known as Abydos, Nakada, and Hyrcanopolis. And they had gold mines as well. The 3 city-states would fight for control of the Nile until Abydos won and conquered the Upper Egypt. Under King Menes, Upper and Lower Egypt were united, as mentioned before, in 3100 BC. And Egypt is now believed to be the first ever nation-state on Earth, at least that we know of, that's recorded. Because, of course, there could have been civilizations from before Egypt that we literally have no idea of their existence. We have no surviving proof that any of it existed. A lot of it could be genuinely hundreds of miles under the sea. You know, it could be under the Atlantic, submerged. Who knows? Pharaohs were seen as god kings who were human incarnations of the Egyptian god Horus, or Horus. They wore a double crown, which was merged with the white and red crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. The crown has never been found until this day, but artwork from the time proves that it existed. This was the start of the first dynasty under King Narmer, and the palace of the pharaohs was in Memphis. The ancient Egyptians were so ahead of their time that they even had a tax system in BCE, which stands for before Common Era, of course. They used said taxes to build burial sites, as for centuries, or even millennia by this point, they had been burying their dead and had their own religion. They mummified their dead, as everyone knows, most likely due to the early burials naturally drying up the corpses, and this would make them look like mummies even before the practice was created, and it was more than likely the inspiration. Mummification included removing organs, wrapping up the bodies in linen, putting them in a sarcophagus, which is essentially a fancy coffin in a tomb full of gold. This, of course, is how the pharaoh would be buried, with all of the gold. However, even regular civilians had a cheap, basic form of mummification in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians had multiple gods that they believed in. When I say multiple, I literally mean over 2,000 deities. The major ones being Ra, the creator. He was essentially the main god. Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, hence the 2-point capture map, which has now been removed from Overwatch, Set, and Thoth. As we go into the early dynastic period, we get the first surviving uses of hieroglyphics, which was the Egyptian alphabet, and I suppose language. And in this period, canals were being created off of the Nile, leading to expanded agriculture and trade in the kingdom. There were writings in Mesopotamia prior to the hieroglyphics, but they are one of the earliest forms of written language, and we only know so much about ancient Egypt because of them. They have logged thousands of years of human history within this region. They would evolve into more advanced scripts as the years went on, until they would eventually adopt ancient Greek alphabets with the spread of Christianity. And then as Islam came along to the region, they would of course start to use Arabic as they do today. King Jer of the first dynasty invaded the Nubian kingdom and conquered Lower Nubia. The Egyptians then expanded east and conquered the Sinai Peninsula, where the horrible Battlefield 1 map is set. Here, they would open new mines for more resources and founded in Besor, not far from Gaza today in Palestine. It would, however, fall off and lose importance and become ruins. The first dynasty ends with Ka dying in 2910 BC, where a power struggle took place and they started robbing graves in Abydos, which is scummy to say the least. Hoptep II became pharaoh, and he was the first one of the second dynasty. This is because he stopped following traditions, and there was more unrest under his rule. In 2750 BC, rebels would declare independence in Lower Egypt, and King Peribsen abandoned Memphis and stationed himself in Abydos instead. In 2690 BC, roughly, Kasekum, also known as Kasekemwe, became pharaoh of Upper Egypt and reunited the kingdom, defeating the rebels in Lower Egypt. And Egypt prospered under his rule. We moved into the Old Kingdom with King Djoser as the first pharaoh of the third dynasty. His chief architect was Imhotep. You might recognise him from the Mummy film, who was very famous, actually, as he created the world's first big stone structure and the world's first step pyramid. It was the tallest structure in the world when built around 2670 BC, and he was rewarded heavily for this. Huni, the last pharaoh of the third dynasty, ordered the construction of several more small pyramids along the Nile. The fourth dynasty began with Sneferu, who built the Medum Pyramid and the failed Bent Pyramid as it's known today. Under Sneferu, a lot of construction took place, and the Red Pyramid was the most successful build, finished around 2590 BC. Sneferu also sent the military to Sinai to conquer local tribes and expand his territory, and he opened even more turquoise mines. Dendera, Thebes and Edfu developed as powerful rich cities under his reign. He also pioneered painted statues. He was buried in his Red Pyramid, and he had a very prosperous reign. The cities that grew during his reign actually overtaken the ancient cities that were there prior to this in nearby regions. His son Khufu succeeded him. Khufu constructed the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was his final resting place. It is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, alongside 6 others that are no longer in existence. It is the only one still standing today. All of them have been destroyed or have been lost to time. It was the tallest structure on Earth for over 4,000 years until the Lincoln Cathedral was built in England in 1311 CE. Tens of thousands of people are said to have built the Great Pyramid of Giza. But they were not slaves. They were actually regular people that were contributing to society. Labourers. His son, Jedefre, was next, and he introduced Son of Ra as a title future pharaohs would adopt after him. His brother Khafre succeeded him, who built another pyramid in Giza, but he built it smaller than his father's pyramid out of respect. And the Sphinx was also constructed, designed off Khafre himself. So it's basically designed like a lion, but with Khafre's face. So fun fact, when you look at the Sphinx, which you probably have in your life, the face of the Sphinx is meant to look like Khafre himself, the pharaoh at the time in Egypt. Under Menkure, we see signs of decline in the Old Kingdom. He built one final pyramid in Giza, and by 2500 BCE, all of the pyramids in Giza were complete. These were the glory days of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and After these days, people would long for these days to return. However, they never would. This was the prime of ancient Egypt, my friends. This was its richest and most powerful point in history. Shepseskaf was the final ruler of the 4th dynasty who abandoned pyramid construction like an idiot, and the Egyptians would long for someone to return them to the former glory in the end. Then there was Usakaf of the 5th dynasty, who made the ugliest pyramid I've ever seen in my life, and the Sun Temple. Unas was the last pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, who has a really detailed burial chamber. The 6th dynasty began with Teti, who married the king's daughter, as he was a commoner, and women were not exactly in a position to rule at this point in history, as men were seen as superior at the time. And Teti needed to marry the king's daughter in order to solidify his place, his rightful place as king, so that he was seen as legitimate and deserving of the role. The 6th dynasty began around 2345 BCE. Pepi I would rule for 40 years, and people were plotting against him, but they were stopped by an ally called Weni, who brought them to justice. The Bedouin tribes noticed a decline in Egypt and decided to attack from the east in 2300 BCE. But when he pushed them back 5 times, the Nubians to the south were also regaining strength and started challenging Pepi's authority. And then Pepi II, a 6-year-old boy, ascended the throne. And you would believe that with a 6-year-old being on the throne, he would be a terrible ruler and other people would rule for him and he would get deposed and his kingdom would fall apart, just like so many other children that have been monarchs in history, but not in his case. In the case of Pepi II, it was actually quite the opposite. Even though there was significant decline in the Old Kingdom throughout his reign, he actually ended up being the longest reigning leader in world history. If the sources are correct, if it's been deciphered correctly, then it would actually turn out that Pepi II would rule Egypt for 90 years, making him the longest ruler of Egypt, even if not the world, at least to our knowledge at this point in time. In his reign, however, as I said before, there was continued decline, and there were threats from the Bedouins, there was Nubian independence in the south, and nomarchs were turning against the pharaoh and challenging his authority, and people in different regions were starting different dynasties. So pretty much Egypt was falling apart from within. And not only this, but there were also widespread famines across Egypt, and we all know how much people love famines when they're in them. Nobody likes starving, nobody likes dying because they can't eat. And overall, things were just getting worse. Pepi II actually outlived his own sons. He lived that long. He died in 2200 BCE, and so did the Old Kingdom with him. And then, of course, there were 2 more kingdoms in ancient Egypt. However, another thing that followed the death of Pepi II was lots and lots of instability. But that's, pardon me, but that's for the next episode, my friends. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about ancient Egypt. I hope that you've learnt a lot about Egypt. And if you have enjoyed, please drop the video a like. It helps boost my videos in the algorithms, and it also increases my morale to make even more content like this for you. And if you did enjoy, please subscribe to the channel as well if you want to see more, so you can get notifications and watch more of my content. Cheers, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all later.